Gamers have been obsessed with shooters for decades, and its most popular form today is the first-person shooter, catering for everyone from the casual gamer to the competitive circuit. The market is both diverse and lucrative, yet there is one series often cited as the genre's most influential title, a series that acted as a turning point in gaming history and is consistently found topping the lists of the greatest video games of all time. So prepare yourself as we take a full-on look at the origins of quite possibly the best FPS game ever made. The FPS genre has grown into one of gaming's greatest commodities, but the beginnings of this action-packed format began, unusually, at NASA's Ames Research Center in the 1970s. Working here at the time was computer programmer Steve Colley, who began writing a program on his IMLAC PDS computer to navigate mazes from a first-person perspective. His very basic efforts resulted in black walls and green outlines. A simple premise, but in 1973, this was groundbreaking. Steve's workmates, Greg Thompson and Howard Palmer, played the game during their breaks, and after connecting a second IMLAC up via the serial ports, they successfully turned it into a two-player game. The small project continued to grow, and a bit of coding later, guns were added to the game, which Steve had now named Maze War. Maze War, however, shares the title of the earliest FPS ancestor with another game called Space Sim. Developed by Jim Bowery, this first-person space simulation could host up to 32 players at any one time, with players controlling spaceships and firing phasers and torpedoes at each other. It was meant for educational purposes, training pilots and potential astronauts. The US Army became very interested in the game, and Bowery made them a tank simulation version to train their troops. These games were completely experimental. They walked so future titles could run. The term first-person shooter hadn't even been coined yet, and Maze War was referred to as having rat's eye view, due to its rat in a maze-like concept. But it would be a few more years until the game was properly defined, and commercial popularity would surge, and much of this would be owed to one company in particular. Founded in 1991 by game programmers John Carmack and John Romero, id Software entered the video game market with their debut title, Commander Keen. This smooth, horizontal side-scroller demonstrated the team's capabilities, but due to its lack of originality, it struggled to stand out. John Carmack wasn't despondent over this, understanding the need to differentiate themselves. He began experimenting with a new 3D game engine by keeping the viewpoint to just a single plane, a viewpoint we've now come to know as first person. John Romero was enticed by his partner's creation and suggested they try and reboot one of their favorite games, Castle Wolfenstein, a stealth shooter released a decade prior. A few months of development later, and id Software had produced Wolfenstein 3D. The hyper-smooth gameplay they'd achieved in Commander Keen was re-emulated in this title, and as for the graphics, the 90s hadn't seen anything like it. 1993 then saw the company release Doom, and gave players another militarized first-person shooter, this time from the viewpoint of a US Marine, as he battled droves of demons invading from hell. Even smoother gameplay and higher quality graphics were on show, and at its peak, Doom had over 15 million active players. A few years on from this, and id launched Quake in 1996, the first installment in yet another popular shooter series. Id had cornered the market on FPS games, with titles so rich in action and graphics, it would be years before anyone would compete. But those years tallied up, and in the mid-90s, a new company was ready to try their hand at the genre. Exactly 1 month after id Software had launched Quake in the summer of 1996, Valve Corporation was founded by two ex-Microsoft employees in Washington. Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington had worked together for many years at the tech giant, playing major roles in the development of the Windows 95 computer operating system, and had also successfully created a Windows port of id Software's Doom. They had a shared passion for video games, specifically the first-person shooter genre, so they stepped away from Microsoft to pursue their aspirations together. Gabe was keen to try and compete with id Software as best as they could, and was eager to put his own spin on the genre that, in his eyes, was now lacking in any sort of gameplay development. Gabe thought that its games, while admittedly fun to play, were just glorified shooting galleries, requiring little skill for little reward and contained only the bare bones of a storyline. Still, there were some things that Gabe accepted id had done right, such as the cutting-edge engine they'd created for Quake. The newly founded Valve were keen to see what it was capable of and licensed the framework to use themselves. Gabe, Mike, and their now small team of programmers made heavy modifications to the Quake game frame and used this as the foundation to create their own gold source game engine, which featured 70% of their own unique code, plus a brand new AI system. Engine in place, Valve were now ready to begin work on their debut title, focusing on a more narrative-led first-person shooter. Within a few months, the team had animation designs and AI actions ready to present at the 1997 E3 event. Crowds were excited by this newcomer's impressive demonstration, and wanting to maintain the surprises from this new company, Gabe slated the game for an imminent release later that year. But upon returning to Valve's offices, Gabe and many of his employees soon discovered the game's levels were at best disjointed. There were now a large group of people involved in the game's development, and any sense of cohesion had been lost. It was as if 4 or 5 games had been jumbled into one, with different briefs given to different departments. Regrettably for Gabe, he realized his eagerness to please had led to him jumping the gun, and he was forced to scrap their 1997 release date. Valve began stripping back the game and the production process. He organized daily meetings between department heads, so progress was constantly being discussed, and named this group the Cabal. Over the next 6 months, the Cabal discussed every intricate part of the game, producing a 200-page document on every aspect the game had to offer. Newell was dead set on the narrative focus, and brought sci-fi novelist Mark Laidlaw onto the Cabal committee. Mark produced a further 30-page document purely focusing on the game's storyline, utilizing his understanding of narrative fundamentals, which Gabe believed was imperative to the game's success. A year after its original date for release, Valve had finally finished their debut title, which they'd now named Half-Life. Valve had created a blend of engaging plotlines and exciting first-person shooter action that put players in control of not just another military personnel, which was the norm of the FPS genre, but instead, the story was told through physicist Gordon Freeman of the Black Mesa Research Facility. Gordon experiences the worst workday of his life after an experiment gone wrong opens a portal to an alien dimension, and rather than kill every alien in sight, his aim is to simply get out alive. Half-Life didn't just buck the trend in terms of a relatable protagonist, they also made a point to include no cutscenes, which other studios loaded their games up with and relied upon to drive their plot forwards. The storyline of Half-Life is instead told through direct interactions with other characters, and Valve made sure to never break their players' control of Gordon throughout the entire game, from the start to its enigmatic final sequences.
Rather an anticlimax.
Half-Life was the first FPS game to really put the player at the heart of the decision-making, and upon its November 1998 release, was duly rewarded for doing so. Newell and his Cabal were pleased with the outcome of the game, and had budgeted for an expectation of selling 180,000 copies throughout its lifetime. It didn't take long for it to become a US mega hit, and the final 6 weeks of the year saw Gabe's prediction blown out the water, with 200,000 copies sold. 1999 saw the game's popularity grow even further, smashing more sales targets and collecting over 50 different Game of the Year awards from various critical publishers. It was the standout game of the moment, the year, and the decade. Even today, it's still viewed as a defining turning point in not just the first-person shooter genre, but the entirety of the video game industry. id Software had brought the genre to life, but Valve were now defining it. Half-Life would go on to sell nearly 10 million copies in its lifetime, but Gabe wouldn't have known this yet, and plans were being readied for more narrative first-person action. Half-Life was quickly being noted as one of the best video games of all time, and if the sales figures were anything to go by, it was hard to dispute this. Like any successful video game, expansion packs were never too far away, and Valve drafted in the help of Gearbox Software to help them. Expansion packs of this time were expected to pick up where their main title had finished, but in the case of Half-Life Opposing Force, released in 1999, players were taken right back to the start of that fateful day at the Black Mesa research facility. However, this time they were tasked with controlling the alien invasion as Marine soldier Adrian Shepard. The second expansion pack, released 2 years later in 2001, also gave a fresh perspective on the events of the invasion, as players investigated the research halls as security guard Barney Calhoun. Mark Laidlaw was still heading up the game's narrative and made sure that the chronology of the events was accurate and gave gamers small glimmers into the overlaps of the different characters' exploits, having them cross paths only once or twice a game with each other. This was an important concept that Valve and Gearbox executed perfectly, retelling an experience from multiple points of view which all blended together to provide players with a complete understanding of an extensive narrative. Half-Life had set the bar for the first-person shooter genre, and now the expansion packs offered an alternative way to use video games as a foundation for complex storytelling. Half-Life was generating expansion pack after expansion pack, but aside from the engaging narrative and high-quality graphics, the game's code was also being put to use elsewhere, and was ready to make its own alternative imprint on the gaming world by providing the building blocks for a new title altogether. From early simulation games to id Software's 90s dominance, the FPS genre has seen rapid changes in a short space of time, but newcomer Valve Corporation believed the extreme violence of these shooters lacked any narrative intrigue, and aimed to set the record straight. With their debut release of Half-Life in 1998, Valve had created a top-selling franchise at their first attempt and generated a fanbase that would soon prove to be one of the most robust in all of gaming. While Valve and Gearbox had been busy expanding the Half-Life universe, the code itself had been evolving in its own manner, at the hands of players and fans who'd used the software development kit for Valve's Gold Source game engine. Many used Half-Life as the basis to form their own modified versions of the game, and it wasn't long before these became available for download on the internet. Most were standard mods, adding new guns to the otherwise untouched gameplay of Half-Life. But there was one that stuck out, catching the attention of Valve themselves. Counter-Strike. Now, we've already covered the story of Counter-Strike here on Origins, with Valve acquiring the rights to this multiplayer first-person shooter during the turn of the millennium. The team-based objective games proved very popular with Half-Life fans, and Valve brought the Counter-Strike developers onto their team to continue development of the game. Valve made sure to focus on improving the most popular aspects of this title, mainly its high skill ceiling for strategic multiplayer gameplay. There were new deviations released for Counter-Strike over the next few years, with single-player campaign modes and more multiplayer objectives. Yet the original title maintained an appeal that couldn't be budged, ushering in a whole new era of FPS-driven esports. The third installment in the multiplayer franchise was Counter-Strike Source, which Valve hoped would consolidate what fans enjoyed most about the game series. Quite simply, it was a remake of the original Counter-Strike, with one key difference. It utilized Valve's new Source game engine, vastly improving both gameplay and graphics. But for Counter-Strike Source, however nice the updates were, it was really just a test game to assure the new game engine worked for Valve's upcoming and eagerly anticipated title, the next installment into the Half-Life franchise. Half-Life 2 development had begun almost immediately after the first title had been released, but Gabe was never going to let work on the next title become rushed. The expansion packs were giving fans what they needed to tide them over, and Gabe saw no reason to create anything other than, in his words, one of the greatest games of all time. With Mike Harrington now stepping away from Valve, Gabe set an unlimited budget for his development team with no deadlines. Mark Laidlaw returned as a narrative expert, this time establishing family relations between characters, strengthening the connection between them and the players. The dev team wanted to go much bigger than the first Half-Life game, which, while a monumental achievement, was confined to just the research facility and a select few trips to fairly linear alien planets. For this next game, they wanted an open world feel, and voted on an Eastern European city setting. Their new Source engine gave them the ability to create complex game physics and animations, and at the 2003 E3 event, they finally announced the game was in development with a small showreel of their work, careful to keep much of their progress under wraps. The biggest news to come from the E3 conference, though, was Gabe's announcement that Half-Life 2 would release in September that year. High on the crowd's excitement, Gabe returned to Valve's Washington offices, ready to oversee the final development stages. But things were about to take a turn. Programmers had been working around the clock and were practically sleeping at their desks just to get this game ready. Gabe remained silent, watching from the sideline and hoping for a miracle. But the miracle never came. And begrudgingly, just a month before fans expected to battle aliens once again, Valve announced it would be delayed, with little suggestion as to a revised release date. One fan was particularly upset and couldn't accept the news. They decided to take matters into their own hands. In October of 2003, a month after the game should have been released, an unknown hacker infiltrated Valve's online servers, stealing the source code for Half-Life 2. They uploaded the files online, showing how far behind in development the game was, revealing masses of information about it. Valve were in shock. Gabe was furious, and Half-Life 2 had developed a bad reputation before anyone had even played it. Key information about the upcoming title had been broadcast around the world, and the game's main selling point, its storyline, had been compromised. In March 2004, after months of searching for the hacker, German citizen Axel Gemby contacted Gabe directly, coming forward as the hacker. He explained in a phone call with the Valve founder that he was just a superfan, wanting to provide answers for the rest of the fanbase. Gabe wasn't happy, but pretended to be impressed with Axel's work, and orchestrated, alongside the FBI, a fake interview to arrest Axel in America. But before this could happen, German police arrested Axel in May 2004 and dealt with him on their terms. Even with this ongoing distraction, Valve's attention never swayed from making Half-Life 2 the best it could possibly be, and continuously strived to do right by their fans. Production value increased to over $1 million a month on development, and programmers worked tirelessly to reward the patience of their audience. Finally, on October 13, 2004, Half-Life 2 was completed, and a month later, it went on sale. It had endured quite an ordeal, with delays, hackers, and furious fan bases demanding answers. But let us tell you, it was well worth the wait. Following on from Gordon Freeman's enlistment by the enigmatic G-Man at the end of Half-Life 1, our favourite physicist was awoken after 20 years in stasis to find the Earth has been taken over by the Combine alien race. After infiltrating the dystopian setting of City 17, he allies with a small group of resistance fighters. Some, like Barney Calhoun, players had met before, and others, like Resistance leader Alex Vance, were brand new to the series. The game also introduced players to the gravity gun, giving them the ability to manipulate large objects with a futuristic weapon. Valve were now flexing their muscles with their new Havoc physics engine, integrated into the source engine code, providing real-world simulations that were so technical they were incomparable to any other game. After more alien battles and some emotional deaths that narrative creator Mark Laidlaw had expertly planned out, Gordon and the Resistance fighters emerged victorious, and he's placed back into cryosleep, awaiting his next mission. Half-Life 2 was seen as an equal match for the original title in every way, with an intricate storyline, superb graphics, and incredible gameplay experience. Some reviewers even went as far to describe it as better than the original. It took home 39 Game of the Year awards from various reviewers, and over its lifetime surpassed 12 million copies sold. Gabe had learned that Half-Life fans would appreciate more of the franchise in a shorter space of time, rather than waiting many years for larger installments. With this understanding of their fanbase, the team at Valve planned and announced a new episodic trilogy, beginning with the simply named Half-Life 2 Episode 1 in 2006. Valve made sure to hit their deadlines this time, and put players in control of Gordon, once again working alongside Alex Vance. Valve vastly improved Alex's AI interface, to the point that she became not just a companion character, but a vital part of Gordon's success. They introduced elements to the game that made players feel like Alex was working with them, and not just following Gordon. For example, they allowed players to conserve their ammo by shining their torch at enemies, illuminating them for Alex to shoot at instead. Alex was becoming a major part of the franchise, and Valve continued her development in Episode 2 the following year. Mark Laidlaw made her more relatable to the game's fanbase as her relationship with her father, Eli, evolves, with a focus on using this trilogy to delve deeper into the backstories of the characters. Valve made sure to put no official release date on Episode 3, and development went on for a few years. Fans assumed the climax to this episodic series needed a bit more work than the first two, and were happy to give Valve the time they needed to perfect the final piece to their trilogy. Bits of concept art were leaked here and there, but nothing concrete came from Valve, and years passed without even a trailer. It was now 2016, 8 years since Half-Life had lent its name to anything, and a frustrated Mark Laidlaw finally left Valve, expressing how he'd tried to hang on long enough to finish up their original plans for an episodic trilogy. It was a sad end to such an iconic series, but fans would at least have the memories of Half-Life 1 and 2 to remember with fondness as they gave up on Valve. But Valve hadn't given up on them. They'd been working hard behind the scenes on their Source 2 game engine, and in 2020, some 13 years after the last Half-Life game, Valve released a Half-Life title like no other, bringing Half-Life Alyx to the realms of virtual reality. This was no expansion pack, spin-off, or the Episode 3 that fans were expecting, and was instead a main title release in the series. Put in control of Resistance leader Alex Vance, the game is set between the events of Half-Life and Half-Life 2, as Alex and her father Eli fight to break into a vault, supposedly storing a weapon strong enough to defeat the Combine alien race. Key characters from the series returned once again to maintain the complex narrative structures that had earned the franchise's position of distinction. The game followed the trend set by other Half-Life titles by setting new standards, this time with virtual reality, winning Best VR Game at the 2020 Game Show Awards, and receiving 5 nominations at the BAFTA Video Game Awards, including Best Game. After over a decade of no Half-Life installments, Valve have brought the franchise firmly into modern times, and rejuvenated the intrigue for where they will take the series next. The FPS genre has never been the same since the original Half-Life title, and its return to the gaming world via VR has been long overdue. Gabe Newell has always maintained a methodical approach to the series, but his passion for gaming perfection is something fans have learnt to live with the promise of a unique and top-drawer gaming experience with every title. Whether Gordon Freeman's story is finished for good is a complete unknown for now, as Alex Vance looks to have taken over as the series' main protagonist. Whether we see a return to Half-Life roots or not, it's somewhat inconsequential. The original game showed us that the impact of the story was driven by alternate perspectives of that one fateful day at the Black Mesa Research Institute. Valve didn't tell us a story, they merely let it unravel, allowing the player to put together the pieces. In gaming may set a new precedent for storytelling. Whichever direction Valve take the series in next, we can say with confidence that they will set that bar even higher once again. Thanks for watching Origins, we'll see you on the next one.